Let me tell you about a woman named Ruth. But before I tell you about Ruth, I need you to understand something. Ruth's story didn't begin with a blessing. It began with loss. There was a man from Bethlehem named Elimelech. He had a wife named Naomi, and they had 2 sons. They lived in Bethlehem, in the land of Judah. And normally, Bethlehem was home. But there came a time when the land was suffering from a famine. There wasn't enough food. So Elimelech looked at his wife and his 2 sons and made a decision. We have to leave. Naomi probably didn't want to leave. Bethlehem was home. Her family was there. Her memories were there. But sometimes life forces you to leave places you thought you'd never leave. So Elimelech took Naomi and their 2 sons, and they moved to the land of Moab. They went there looking for a better life, looking for food, looking for security, looking for a future. And for a while, maybe they thought everything was going to be okay. But then something happened that nobody expected. Elimelech died. Naomi became a widow. And now she was left with her 2 sons. You can imagine the pain. But at least she still had her children. At least she wasn't alone. Her 2 sons eventually married Moabite women. One was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. And Ruth is where the story really begins. Because for about 10 years, Naomi's family lived in Moab. 10 years. A whole decade. And then tragedy struck again. Both of Naomi's sons died. Now, think about that. This woman had lost her husband, and now she had lost both of her sons. She was a widow, and her daughters-in-law were widows. 3 women, 3 broken hearts. 3 lives that suddenly looked completely different. Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people back home and had given them food again. So she decided, I'm going back to Bethlehem. She packed whatever she had, and Ruth and Orpah started walking with her. But somewhere along that road, Naomi stopped. She looked at these 2 young women, and she said, Go back. Go back to your mother's house. Return to your people. You don't have to come with me. Maybe Ruth looked at her and thought, What are you talking about? But Naomi continued, You're young. You still have a chance to rebuild your life. Go home, find another husband, start again. And the women began crying. They hugged each other. They didn't want to leave Naomi. But Naomi insisted. Eventually, Orpah kissed Naomi goodbye. She cried. She hugged her. And she turned around. She went back to Moab. But Ruth wouldn't move. Naomi looked at her and said, Your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and her gods. You should go too. And Ruth looked at Naomi. And this time, Ruth wasn't crying just because she was sad. She had made a decision. She said, Don't ask me to leave you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. Think about that. Ruth had every reason to walk away. She had lost her husband. She had no guarantee that following Naomi would make her life better. She wasn't even from Israel. She was a Moabite woman. She was leaving behind everything she knew. Her country, her family, her culture, her old life. And she was walking into an uncertain future with an older widow who had nothing to offer her. But Ruth said, I'm going with you. And Naomi realized Ruth wasn't changing her mind. So the 2 women continued walking all the way to Bethlehem. And when they finally arrived, the whole town was talking. People looked at Naomi and said, Is that Naomi? She had been gone for years, and now she was back. But Naomi wasn't the same woman who had left. She said to them, Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara, because the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Imagine saying that. I left full. I'm coming back empty. Naomi thought that was her story. She thought the chapter had ended. She didn't know that God was already beginning another chapter. And Ruth was standing beside her. A woman Naomi didn't even realize would become part of the greatest restoration of her life. Now they were back in Bethlehem. But there was a problem. They had no food, no husband, no sons, no money, nothing. So Ruth said, "Let me go into the fields. Maybe someone will allow me to gather whatever grain the workers leave behind." In those days, farmers were instructed not to harvest every last bit of grain. Some was intentionally left behind for the poor, widows, foreigners, and people in need. So Ruth went. She walked into a field, and she started gathering grain. She didn't know whose field it was. She didn't know who owned it. She didn't know what was about to happen. She was simply trying to survive. But the Bible says something very interesting. It says, Ruth happened to come to a field belonging to a man named Boaz. Happened. That's how it looked from Ruth's perspective. She just happened to walk into that field. But sometimes what looks like coincidence to you is providence from God. Ruth was working. Then Boaz came to the field. He saw the workers. Then he noticed Ruth. He asked his servant, "Who is that woman?" The servant explained, "She is the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi. She has been working since morning." She barely stopped. Boaz walked over to Ruth, and he said, "Listen to me. Don't go to another field. Stay here. Stay close to my workers. I've told the men not to bother you. And whenever you're thirsty, drink from the water they have drawn." Ruth was shocked. She bowed down. She said, "Why have I found favor in your eyes? I'm a foreigner." Boaz looked at her, and he said something beautiful. "I have heard everything you've done for Naomi. I've heard how you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you've come to a people you didn't know before. May the Lord reward you for what you've done. May you receive a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Ruth didn't know it yet, but the woman who had left her homeland was about to find a new home. The woman who had lost her husband was about to meet a man who would change her future. And the woman who thought she was empty was about to become part of a story much bigger than herself. Boaz told his workers to pull out extra grain for Ruth. He told them not to embarrass her, not to stop her. Let her gather. So Ruth worked until evening. Then she gathered everything she had collected and took it home. When Naomi saw how much grain Ruth had brought back, she was surprised. She asked, "Where did you work today?" Ruth told her, "The man's name is Boaz." And Naomi suddenly stopped. "Boaz?" She knew that name. She said, "Blessed be the Lord. That man is one of our relatives. He is one of our family redeemers." Now that changes everything. Because in Israel, a family redeemer was someone from the extended family who could step in to help protect the family's inheritance and future. And Naomi realized something. Maybe God hadn't abandoned them. Maybe there was still a future. So Naomi told Ruth, "Stay close to Boaz's workers. Don't go anywhere else." And Ruth did exactly that. She continued working in Boaz's fields through the barley harvest and the wheat harvest. But Naomi started thinking. She looked at Ruth, and she knew Ruth needed more than food. She needed a future. So Naomi came up with a plan. One evening, she said, "Ruth, get yourself ready. Go down to where Boaz is working. Wait until he has finished eating and drinking. Then go to him." Now, this wasn't about seduction. This was about Ruth asking Boaz to fulfill the role of family redeemer. Ruth followed Naomi's instructions. That night, after Boaz had finished working, he lay down. Later, he woke up and realized someone was lying near his feet. He was startled. "Who are you?" Ruth answered, "It is Ruth. Spread your garment over me, because you are a family redeemer." Boaz understood exactly what she was asking, and he was impressed by her character. He said, "May the Lord bless you. You have shown even more kindness now than before." But then Boaz told her something. "There is another man who is a closer relative than I am. If he is willing to redeem you, let him. But if he isn't, then I will." Ruth had to wait. Again, she had already waited through grief. She had waited through poverty. She had waited while gathering grain. And now she had to wait for an answer that would determine her future. The next morning, Boaz went to the city gate. That's where important legal matters were handled. He found the closer relative and brought him before the elders. Boaz said, "Naomi has returned from Moab, and there is land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. If you want to redeem it, redeem it." The man said, "Yes, I'll redeem it." But Boaz wasn't finished. He explained that whoever redeemed the land would also take Ruth, the Moabite widow, as his wife, in order to preserve the family line. The man's answer changed. He said, "I can't redeem it. You redeem it." And just like that, Boaz became the redeemer. The man who had first seen Ruth gathering scraps in his field was now about to become her husband. Boaz took Ruth as his wife, and God blessed them with a son. His name was Obed. And now I want you to imagine Naomi, the same woman who came back to Bethlehem saying, "Call me Mara. I went away full, and the Lord brought me back empty." Now she's holding a baby. The women of Bethlehem gathered around her. They said, "Blessed be the Lord. He has not left you without a redeemer." They celebrated with her. They told her that this child would restore her life. And Naomi took that baby. She held him close. The woman who thought her story was over was now holding a new beginning. But here's where the story gets even bigger, because Obed had a son. His name was Jesse, and Jesse had a son. His name was David. Yes, David, the same David who would become king of Israel, the same David who would fight Goliath, same David whose name would become one of the most important names in Israel's history. And where did that family line begin? With Ruth, a Moabite woman, a foreigner, a widow, a woman who had no idea what God was doing. Ruth thought she was simply following Naomi home. She thought she was simply gathering grain. She thought she was simply gathering grain. But God was writing a story, a much bigger story. And generations later, Ruth would become part of the family line that led to Jesus Christ. Think about that. Ruth couldn't see it when she was walking down that road. She couldn't see it when she entered Boaz's field. She couldn't see it when she was gathering grain. She couldn't see it when she was waiting for Boaz to speak to the family redeemer. She couldn't see it when she married Boaz. She couldn't see it when she held Obed. But God could see the whole story. And that's what makes Ruth's story so powerful. Because sometimes you're standing in the middle of your story, and all you can see is loss. You can't see the next chapter. You can't see the blessing. Can't see the restoration. You can't see what God is building. All you see is what you've lost. Naomi saw emptiness. Ruth saw uncertainty. But God saw a lineage. God saw David. God saw Jesus. God saw generations that hadn't even been born yet. And that's the part I don't want you to miss. Ruth didn't get a miracle because everything suddenly became easy. She got there by walking. She walked away from Moab. She walked beside Naomi. She walked into a field. She worked. She waited. She trusted. She remained faithful. And while Ruth was being faithful with what was in front of her, God was arranging what was ahead of her. She didn't know Boaz was in that field. She didn't know he was a family redeemer. She didn't know he would become her husband. She didn't know she would have a son. She didn't know her son would become part of David's family line. She didn't know her name would eventually appear in the genealogy of Jesus. She just kept walking, and sometimes that's faith. Sometimes faith isn't knowing where the road ends. Sometimes faith is simply taking the next step. You might be in a season where you feel like Naomi. You look at your life and say, "I came here with something, and now I feel empty." Or maybe you're like Ruth. You're standing in a field you never planned to enter. You're working, you're trying, you're wondering, "God, where are you?" But you don't know that the field you're standing might be connected to the future you've been praying for. You don't know who God has placed in that field. You don't know what conversation is coming. You don't know what door is about to open. You don't know what relationship God is going to use. You don't know what seed you're planting right now that somebody else will benefit from years from now. Ruth didn't see the whole picture. She just stayed faithful. And God did what only God could do. He took a woman who had lost almost everything and placed her in the family line of the king. He took a woman who was a foreigner and gave her a place among his people. He took a widow and gave her a husband. He took a woman with no obvious future and gave her a future that would outlive generations. So if you're in a season where you don't understand what God is doing, remember Ruth, because Ruth's story teaches us something. Just because you can't see what God is doing doesn't mean God isn't doing anything. Naomi thought she was empty, but God was preparing restoration. Ruth thought she was simply surviving, but God was positioning her. Boaz thought he was simply helping a widow, but God was using him to continue a family line. And generations later, Jesus would come, the Savior, the Redeemer, the one who would come not only for Israel, but for the nations. And maybe that's why Ruth's story matters so much, because Ruth was an outsider who was welcomed in. She was someone who came from another people, and yet she found refuge under the wings of the God of Israel. Her story reminds us that God can take someone who feels like they don't belong and give them a place in His story. So don't despise your small beginning. Don't despise the field. Don't despise the season of gathering little by little. Don't despise the waiting. Don't despise the road you're walking because you don't know where it ends. Ruth didn't know. Naomi didn't know. Boaz didn't know the full picture. But God knew, and He was writing the story the whole time. Sometimes all God asks you to do is keep walking. Keep serving. Keep trusting. Keep showing up. Keep gathering the grain. Keep your heart faithful, because one day you might look back and realize that field wasn't random. That delay wasn't wasted. That season wasn't empty. That road wasn't taking me nowhere. God was leading me somewhere. Ruth thought she was following Naomi, but ultimately she was being led by God. And the story she thought was about surviving became a story about redemption, a story about restoration, a story about faithfulness, and a story that would eventually lead all the way to Jesus. So if you're somewhere in the middle of your story right now, don't give up because you can't see the ending. You may only see the field. God sees the harvest. You may only see the loss. God sees the restoration. You may only see the waiting. God sees the purpose. And you may think your story is finished when God is only beginning to write the next chapter. Just keep walking, because you never know what God is doing in the field you're standing in.